you for joining me. I know you're super excited right after lunch. We'll see if we can keep this from being a snooze fest. And looking forward to having some interaction. So you have to stay awake so that you can answer my questions and stuff. My name is Angie Shamblin, and I am with Redden Associates. We are human resource consultants. So we mostly work with businesses who don't have necessarily on-site expertise in providing training, that kind of thing. So that's how I got to be here today. We're going to talk about harassment, everybody's favorite subject. But in order to talk about harassment, I'm going to start by talking about the idea of respect, because if we're really looking at trying to avoid harassment in the workplace, if we focus on that idea of being respectful, I think it's very helpful in helping to assure what types of behaviors we want to have and what types of behaviors we want to avoid. So that idea of respect, what I want you to do is think about it and give me some ideas of other words or terms or ideas that come to mind when you think of the word respect. What comes to mind?
Treat others as you want to be treated.
Okay, so kind of that golden rule, right? Which is that treating others the way that we want to be treated. I missed yours.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, being polite. Maybe having good manners goes with that. Okay. What else? What else would you think of when you think of the word respect?
Personal space.
Anything else? See how I told you you had to stay awake the whole time? All right, well, let's talk a little bit more about this idea of the golden rule, because I think that's really important as far as we've all been kind of brought up to think about the golden rule, treating others the way that they want or the way that we want to be treated. But when we're talking about avoiding harassment in the workplace, we actually take it kind of to the golden rule plus idea, which is rather than treating others the way that we want to be treated, we actually have to try to put ourselves in the other person's shoes a little bit and treat them the way that they want to be treated. So in other words, when I'm using language, when I'm telling jokes, when I'm interacting with other people, I might think this joke is really, really funny. And yet, if it could be seen as being offensive to somebody else, then it wouldn't be appropriate to the workplace. So actually, we do have to kind of go that step further and say, okay, there's the golden rule, but this is actually going beyond the golden rule. We're looking to try to figure out what's acceptable behavior, what's going to be offensive, and putting ourselves in that other person's shoes a little bit and trying to treat other people the way that they want to be treated. Does that make sense? Okay? All right, so we know, just by the fact that I'm here today, that Western Polymer has made a commitment to their employees to provide a workplace that's free of disrespectful or offensive behavior. And so the fact that we're here, we're having this meeting, we're talking about it, obviously shows a part of that commitment. The other thing that shows that commitment is the fact that you guys have had a harassment policy in place for some time. So this is not new, but I am going to have you each take a copy of that. Before you leave today, I'm going to ask you to read through it and sign it. But at this point, what we're going to do is just look at one part of it that I want to especially focus on. part of this policy, and this policy came straight out of your handbook, so like I said, it's not new, but we kind of separated it so we could focus on it a little bit more. The first part really has to do with what, defining harassment, so I'm not going to spend any time on that because we'll be going through that in the training. Instead, I'd like you to go to page 2 and look at the complaint procedure. One of the most important parts of the policy is the fact that you do have a clearly spelled out complaint procedure. And what it says is, if you cannot come to satisfactory resolution with your supervisor or are uncomfortable talking to your supervisor, the company has designated several people to whom you may bring a complaint if you believe that this policy has been violated. So it's either the controller, Deborah Helliwell, or the CEO. Okay? So if you feel as if the policy has been violated, I will say the very first thing I always recommend is, if you feel comfortable, telling the person that you feel is the harasser that you'd like the behavior to stop. That's, I think, the best approach. 98% of the time, it will work. If you tell the person that you don't appreciate the behavior or you want it to stop, most likely they will stop it. But you are not required to do that. There is no rule that says you must tell the harasser first, okay? So that's an option, and it's a good option. But if you're not comfortable doing that, then your other option is to either go to your supervisor or go to Deborah or Lynn, okay? So you have different options, and you get to choose the one that you feel most comfortable with. Does that make sense? All right. And then it kind of talks about the rest of the process from there. But that's the part I really wanted to focus on first, is just letting you know that there is a process for making a complaint. And it is pretty clearly spelled out, and so there shouldn't be any hesitation on your part to know what to do if something occurs. Okay? All right, well, if we're going to talk about harassment, we have to talk about the law, because it is against the law. And it has been for a really long time, probably since a lot of you, or before a lot of you were born. It was actually part of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So it's been around a long time. It's been illegal a long time. But then in 1980, we actually got a little more information about it. So they started defining what harassment was more so in 1980. And so the definition says, unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature constitutes sexual harassment when submission to such conduct is made either explicitly or implicitly a term or condition of an individual's employment. Submission to or rejection of such conduct by an individual is used as the basis for employment decisions affecting the individual. So I think most of us have this kind of part of the definition in mind when we think about harassment. We think about these two first bullet points. Who, in this first part of the definition, who could be a harasser in that case?
Supervisors.
Supervisors, right, exactly. Somebody who has power and authority, and they use that power or authority to gain sexual favors from someone else. Okay, so it's pretty much kind of that definition that a lot of us have in mind, I think, when we think of sexual harassment. Interestingly enough, though, in the last several years, most of the complaints that come through actually have to do with this third bullet point. Such conduct has the purpose or effect of unreasonably interfering with an individual's work performance or creating an intimidating, hostile, or offensive working environment. So in that case, who could the harasser be?
Employees?
It could be absolutely anybody in the workplace, right? It could be coworkers, it could be a supervisor, it could be a vendor, it could be a customer. anybody who comes into the workplace actually could be someone who could create that intimidating, hostile, or offensive working environment. So when we think about the types of behaviors that could create that intimidating, hostile, or offensive working environment, those behaviors normally fall into one of three categories: physical, verbal, or nonverbal. Okay. So, tell me some examples of physical behaviors that could create that hostile or offensive working environment.
Someone touching you?
That's pretty broad, huh? Touching. It's like, wow, that's a broad idea, but I think we do have some information that can kind of help narrow that idea of touching down. I always laugh when I do this part of the training because I think somebody somewhere is sitting here making up these rules for us, and I can't imagine what that person's job is. But anyway, the rule that they have come up with, is that normally touching between here and here is okay. Okay? The reason I say normally is because, again, it very much varies. And if we go back to that original idea of the golden rule plus, we need to understand that people are different, and different people are going to have different levels of comfort with any kind of touching. So, Tim, can I use you as an example? All right. So, if Tim is my coworker or my employee and I come up to him and I say, gosh, Tim, you did such a great job on that project, I really appreciate it. Exactly. Most people are going to be okay with that, right? But if I do that, and when I do it this time, lean back away from me when I go to do that. So if I come up and I do this, what's that telling me?
You don't want you to touch it.
Exactly. Doesn't make Tim weird, doesn't make him wrong. It just means that he has a different comfort level, and I need to be aware of that. People are not always going to come out and say, by the way, just so you know, I don't like any touching, right? What they're going to do is they're going to give us some nonverbal cues instead, and that helps us to understand what their comfort level is. So if we look at treating people the way that they want to be treated, not just what I think is okay, but putting myself in Tim's shoes and going, okay, with Tim that's going to be a no-go, and looking for those cues and following them. Okay? So that's touching. What about verbal? What's an example of verbal behavior that could be seen as creating that hostile or offensive working environment?
Yelling.
Yelling.
Being short or impatient.
Okay. Kind of abrupt. Will,
There you go. That's the right word.
okay. Impatient. Good.
Name calling a bad name.
Okay. And I'm just going to say using bad language and name calling. Okay?
Humor.
Some humor, absolutely. There are jokes that would be inappropriate. Mm-hmm. Okay. What about nonverbal? What are some nonverbal behaviors?
Ignoring people when they talk to you.
Well, I'm just not
That's
sure.
a nice mix.
I'm not sure. Here's what I can tell you. Here's what I can tell you, because it's interesting that you should say that. There was actually a court case a number of years ago in Washington that went all the way to the Washington Supreme Court, and they decided was that rudeness was not illegal. So, yeah. So while that ignoring behavior could be seen as terribly rude, it would not,
Okay.
yeah. Yep. What else? What else nonverbal?
Body language.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Email.
Good.
Email.
Like those emails that go around that sometimes are crude or rude or.
Don't pretend you don't know what you mean.
Yeah, it's like email. Okay.
Hand signals.
Yep. Hand signals.
One.
Just part of the hand.
Yeah.
Dirty looks. Or
Yeah.
glaring.
Yep. And I'm gonna call that glaring or maybe leering, you know? Interesting thing too is sometimes it's not the words that are being said, sometimes it's how the words are said, right? And so, as an example, somebody at work might say, "Oh, Angie, you look nice today." I'd be like, "Oh, thanks." But if they kind of looked you up and down and said, "Ooh, Angie, you look nice today," that's a whole different idea, isn't it? Right. So that nonverbal speaks to not only, you know, it speaks to how we say things. Mhm. All right, so that's a pretty darn good list. The interesting thing too about this whole hostile or offensive working environment is that it does need to be repeated behavior. So remember when we were talking about the definition and the first two bullet points were all about that supervisor to employee and the supervisor using their power or authority to gain sexual favors from an employee? That is in itself considered harassment. So if that happened one time, that would be considered harassment. With this, it's a little less clear-cut. It would normally, in order for it to really be a hostile work environment, it would need to be repeated over time. So I might, in the course of the day, you know, I'm hanging a picture and I drop a hammer on my foot and some type of bad language comes out of my mouth. While that could definitely be offensive to my coworkers, it would not create that hostile work environment if I did that one time. But if I have a tendency to use foul language, plus there's some emails floating around that are inappropriate, plus there's a lot of gesturing or those kinds of things, it's like, okay, now we have things that are kind of piling up. And now we're talking about really creating an environment that makes it very difficult to work in. Okay, so there is that expectation that, you know, people can make mistakes. That can happen in these kinds of examples, but once it becomes just really a part of the regular work environment, it's repetitive, and it goes on for a period of time, then we know that we have a concern about creating that hostile work environment. Okay. Another thing I want to talk about is a little bit just about some of the terms or definitions that you might hear when we're talking about harassment. Quid pro quo is kind of that this for that. So that's that first type of harassment we were talking about with the supervisor and using their authority, gaining something in return for something else. The hostile work environment is just what we're saying, that kind of repetitive behaviors. These types of things can certainly go into creating a hostile work environment. And then one of the most important terms that we use when we're talking about harassment is just that idea of it being unwelcome. So it's not what I am trying to say, it's how it's perceived by the other person. So my intent is not as important as their perception. And if it's unwelcome, then we could be concerned about having it turn into a hostile work environment. All right, I'm gonna have you, because once again, as I mentioned, I like to force fun. I'm gonna have you read through this case study, and then at your table, I want you to follow the directions at the bottom as a group. So there will be interacting that's required. Once you've read through, then discuss the case. When did Jessica cross the line? What should she have done differently? Talk about Tony. What could he have done? And then did he take appropriate action? So chat about it. Let's chat about this a little bit. When did Jessica cross the line?
When she went to his car.
And she wanted to shoot.
There's a couple different points where it gradually progressed into a stronger
Yeah.
pursuit, because like at the bar, he kind of told her he was dating somebody, but he would be more than happy to set her up with somebody. And then the next day she wore the blouse, but even before that, when she overheard the coworkers talking, she kind of thought to herself that she was just going to mysteriously pop up and meet up with them. So, yeah, kind of at that point, yeah, the wheels started to turn in her head.
Yeah, but Tony let her on with before. He should have told her right off the bat.
Exactly.
Hey, I got a girlfriend. You know, I just talk to you and stuff, but that's it. He let it go for a long time.
And I would say, you know, it is kind of complicated because it does build, kind of like over time a little bit. But I would say once he said no, he said he was flattered, and, he'd fix her up with somebody else, but he said he wasn't interested in seeing anyone other than his girlfriend. So he had a very clear no at that point. And so at the point where, to me, that next paragraph that says, that night Jessica decided that she wanted to continue to pursue Tony, boom, that was the point that was overstepping, because she had already been told no. And so the fact that she just made that decision, that was beyond.
She crossed the line in her own mind,
Yep.
and then pursued it physically.
Yep.
Across the
Exactly. So I would love to tell you that these things never happen anymore, but in reality, I'm going to tell you that every one of the case studies I have been aware of or made aware of. And so these are real things that still happen right now. So what should Jessica have done differently?
Left it alone when he said no.
Yeah, once he said no, she should have said, okay, I'm not going to pursue that. Okay? How about Tony? Was there something he could have done differently?
He could have not flirted with her from the get-go
That's right. He could have
Yeah.
stopped teasing her about it.
Yeah.
and said he had a girlfriend even before the bar.
Yeah. And honestly, I think that's the case. I mean, there are people who are flirtatious by nature, but then they're going to find themselves in this position because people will respond assuming that they are available or willing to be available or whatever. So the fact that that flirtation was happening, if he didn't want somebody to pursue it, then he shouldn't have been flirting in reality. So he didn't, it's not like he caused it to happen. He certainly did not have any reason to think that she would start stalking him and coming out to his car and grabbing him by the arm. So he didn't cause it, but at the same time, flirtatious behavior leads somewhere a lot of times. So,
But how can you say it's not a cause when if it leads to something, that's a cause?
well,
Because he did it,
Yeah.
she did what she did.
yeah.
I'm
But
sorry.
once he said no, then
Then she should have stopped.
yeah, absolutely. Did he take appropriate action after Jessica waited by his car?
Yeah.
At that point, yeah.
Yeah, because he already did what he could do. He already told her he wasn't interested, and now she's showing up at his car and continuing to, pursue that. So at that point, I think it's reasonable to go to a supervisor or, the CEO or the controller and just say, hey, now this person is kind of creeping me
Freaking
out. Exactly.
Wouldn't it have been okay though, to told her one more time? No?
Absolutely. It
Yeah.
certainly would
Even
have.
if it happened again, like it was-
Yeah. It's certainly reasonable to do that, but it's not required. You know, it's okay either way. If you want to
An
give her
extra
one.
patient person may have.
Yeah. But he very well may have felt like he did what he should do at that point, which was, I've already told her no, and now she's,
And that kind of goes back to seeing a person's facial reactions and the mannerisms, how serious was she about you, psycho? Going after it, whereas you just waited a minute for them to do it.
yeah. Do you have another comment? No. All right, well,
But I don't.
I did, but I don't.
No, because you know how you said a one-time thing? Well, wouldn't that be a one-time thing? She went up to him one time and he went straight to CEO. So couldn't she be like, hey, that was a one-time thing? Why would I get in trouble if a one-time thing is, you said was okay? Cause like, you know how a cuss word, you said, oh, if I accidentally dropped something and a cuss word slipped out. One
Well, 'cause
time
he's
it's
already
okay.
asked her to stop,
Oh,
and now
okay.
she's
At the bar.
continuing.
But at the bar,
Yeah,
so it doesn't matter where?
no, it wouldn't matter.
Oh,
Yeah, it's not like, well, as long as she's only, you know, stalking me outside of work, no. So, he asked her to stop, she continued. Okay. All right. So, why do we care? Well, certainly, employers care about this because it is the last thing that any employer wants to have to deal with. Legal costs, the costs of a reputation, morale, turnover. You know, the reality is that when harassment occurs, what do you think the most likely thing is? What's the most likely thing that will happen when somebody feels like they're being harassed?
They tell people.
This day and age, Sue Abby.
They quit, almost always. Yep, almost always they quit their jobs. Rather than deal with it, rather than be, you know, it's just like, I hate this, I don't want to deal with it, and they leave.
A lot of people just don't like confrontation.
Exactly. They just, you know, they just don't want to deal with it. And so they end up quitting their jobs and employers lose good employees and they don't even necessarily ever know why. So it's awful for employers from that perspective. Reputation, legal costs. I'm from Spokane, and one of our local companies a number of years ago, and it was called Tidyman's Supermarkets. Have you ever heard of it? Anyway, it was pretty big in that area, a number of branches, and they went out of business over being sued for sexual harassment. It was, you know, devastating, obviously, to that corporation. They did not have the means to defend against that, and, you know, I don't know the particulars of the case, but the company isn't in business anymore. So that's how serious some of these charges can be. So obviously, from the employer's perspective, it's very important to make sure that it's not happening. As far as the harasser, obviously, you're going to have professional concerns. You could be disciplined, you could be terminated, but you can also, harassment is illegal, period. So harassers can also be sued in civil court. And, you know, people can lose their homes because they have a judgment against them for harassment. And then certainly from the perspective of the harassee, there's been tons of evidence by this point that shows just how damaging working in a hostile work environment can be to people's health and, you know, just their productivity and everything else. So regardless of which role one finds themselves in, harassment can be a real negative. The other thing I want to talk about is just this idea, I think we focus a lot of attention on the idea of sexual harassment, which is one aspect. But I want you to look at this list. Age, gender, national origin, race, color, religion, disabilities, citizenship, sexual orientation. All of this law that we have that is against harassment, these are all of the other areas that are protected against harassment in the workplace. Okay, so it isn't just about sexual harassment, it's harassment having to do with every other protected class as well. And I have another little story for you. This is the same kind of thing. I want you to read it through, and then I want you to discuss it at your table, and then be ready to talk about it. What could Fran have done before this happened? Is there anything he could have done?
Not allow him to be called old man.
You should have asked what was going on, or something was different.
Yep. Yeah. It sounds like they have a good work group, a good work environment. He could have certainly asked, what's going on, what's wrong, because he noticed something was going on. And then certainly, because he is the supervisor, Fran should not have allowed people to call Ralph old man. And not only did he allow others to do it, he did it, right? So,
Well, I think part of that too, because it was talking about this 25-year, it goes back a few years where that was common in the workforce, everybody
Yep.
had a little nickname.
Yep.
So,
That's what I got down to is couldn't make himself clear about the fact he was only calling old man as a nickname.
yep.
It's just been stuck for quite a while.
And, if he's been called old man for 20 years, it might have been funny 20 years ago, and now it's not so funny.
Things build though too.
Yep, and things do build, exactly.
You realize he was old.
I know, exactly. That happens without warning, let me tell you. So yeah, I think that all along there were things that Fran, the supervisor, could have done to, I know that nicknames happen, but at the same time, I think it's professional to say, what do you like to be called? And then whatever they say, then call them that. Don't make your own nicknames up or that kind of thing.
But like you said, let's say I said one day when I started working here, yeah, you can call me that. And then I get a hair up myself one day and I don't like it anymore. So how is that right when it's saying it's harassment from the get-go if I
Yeah.
allow it and then one day I change it?
That's
Well, here's what I would do if I were in a supervisory role, and what I would do as a coworker. If the nickname fell into any of these areas, I wouldn't use it. Simply, I would not use it in the workplace. Okay? Because here's the other thing that could happen is you could be calling, Ralph old man, and he'd be okay with it, but somebody else who's older than Ralph is finding that to be really offensive. In
The
reality.
younger guy just hasn't earned his respect yet, maybe, or put in the time, so to speak, to have that kind of bond, or whatever it is.
It could be, or he could just be very sensitive now because, he is older, definitely, okay? So now what? Now what do you do if you're Fran at this point? You're the supervisor, now what do you do?
Asking if there's something going on outside of work first, if there's any other health issue or personal issue, and then go to maybe if it's just with the fact that it was the younger guy calling him old man, that really bothered him, and kind of got under his skin.
So you could find out if there's anything more that's going on with Ralph. What else?
Have a meeting and say no more nicknames. Let's harassment meeting.
Yeah.
Here it comes.
Here it comes. Yeah, because in reality, as the supervisor, you have the expectation for setting the standard for a respectful work environment. And so this kind of thing, even though it's been going on a long time and it's okay with everybody, in reality, it really is not. You know, because it still meets that criteria of being not necessarily complimentary to somebody based on their protected class status. Okay? So when we're reading this, and we can look at it and say, you know, his nickname or what he's been called as old man, just insert any nickname or name calling that you might think of related to any of these areas, and we know that that would not be okay. Okay? All right. Another thing to just kind of think about when you're looking at your behavior at work is asking yourself questions like, is this behavior that I'm proud of? Would I engage in this behavior, tell this joke, stare this way, if my spouse, parents, significant other, children were standing here? You know, in that first case, when we had the guy who was flirty, would he have behaved that way if his significant other had been there? Not likely, right? So that would have been a good way to say, oh, this is probably not a good idea. Would I want my behavior to be the front article in the newspaper or plastered all over the internet? And ultimately, is my behavior respectful of the people that I work with? That's really what it comes down to. So, does this mean I can't tell jokes or use humor at work? Now see, that was humorous right there. It was not at all harassing. So, no, and it, you know, I do these trainings and it just always is kind of personal to me because I love humor. I could not work in an environment without humor. So humor is a big part of just how I deal. And so I know that there is plenty of positive, you know, humor out there. We might have to dig a little harder, but it's definitely out there. How about telling someone they look nice? Yeah, no kidding, exactly. Once again, it depends on how we tell them, right? So we just want that to, exactly. Can't do that, right? And it also, you know, we're also just wanting to be aware of how it's being received, right?
So like I said, kind of look very nice today.
There you go. How about talking about personal information? Can we do that with people at work?
I like this receptive back and forth between the two.
I think that that's really the key to most of this, is if I start asking somebody, you know, how many kids do you have, you're married, where do you live, where'd you go to school, you know, those kinds of things, and their response to me is very short and very, you know, minimal, then what is that telling me? They don't want to have, yeah, they're not wanting to have that kind of personal relationship. Again, that is perfectly acceptable. It's okay for them to have that response. I just need to be aware of that and then follow those cues. Asking someone to lunch, same thing. You know, if I ask somebody to lunch and I do that a couple of times and every time it's no and they seem to not want to, you know, interact, drop it. Exactly. It's like, okay, that's, people are different and that's okay. But we just want to be aware of that we're not pushing ourselves on people when they're not wanting them. Okay? So the expectations employees should have is, or the expectations employees have are to take responsibility for your own behavior, abide by company policies, we know we have a policy in place, maintain an atmosphere based on mutual respect, so being respectful for the people around you, and in return you can expect a work environment that promotes productivity and, you know, a positive work experience. Open communication, you know what to do if you have a concern or a complaint and who to bring that to help get a resolution. And then you should expect, again, that respectful work environment where you're free from the things that could create a hostile work environment. So you're interacting with people and they're doing that appropriately and your supervisor is supporting that type of environment. What I'd like you to do, oh, I do want to show you one more slide instead. I guess the other thing I just want to underline is the responsibility that your supervisors do have. And so when they are coming over to you or your manager comes to you and says, oh, you know, that was kind of crossing the line, or gosh, I need you to not tell those kind of jokes, or that language that I heard you use is not appropriate for work, they're doing their job. They're doing what they're being asked to do. So rather than taking that personally or feeling like you're being picked on, you know, hopefully you'll just go, okay, I get it, that is that person's job. And they're there just to reinforce, truly, that the expectations and support that positive environment. And so I guess that's the other thing, is just cutting them a bit of a break to understand that that's what they're supposed to do, that's what they've been provided guidance on doing, and so the expectation that that may happen, and that too should be okay. So because everybody loves quizzes, the good news is you don't have to turn this in and it doesn't become a part of your file or anything like this. But I do want you to fill it out and then we're going to go through it.
Very good.
Yes? I saw one in your hand, but I'm like, it's out there. These are true or false. The best approach for a woman being sexually harassed is to ignore the behavior or laugh it off.
False.
Okay? What's the best approach? Right. Tell the person to stop. However, you're not required to do that, right? You also have the ability to, you know, make a complaint if you need to do that. So I think the best approach is to tell the person to stop, but if you're not comfortable doing that, then you can go to your supervisor or the controller or CEO. Only supervisors and managers, people who have authority to affect others' job status, can sexually harass.
False. False.
False. Who could harass?
Anybody.
Right, anybody in the work environment. The victim of sexual harassment does not have to be of the opposite sex from the harasser. True. An innocent bystander who is offended by a verbal exchange of a sexual nature between two coworkers cannot claim sexual harassment unless one of the two coworkers does.
False.
Right, false. Because if I'm subjected to this in my work environment, then it could be creating a hostile work environment for me. Okay? Western Polymer has a procedure for complaints.
True.
And what is it again?
Deborah and Emily.
Or your supervisor. Any of those. Okay? Good. The courts have recognized that it is the victim who defines sexual harassment. What bothers one person may not bother another.
True.
True. Right. Because, you know, again, I could be thinking a joke was really funny, but if it was an offensive joke and somebody else found it offensive, then it could be. A team enjoys sharing vulgar jokes and emails at work. This is a regular part of their interaction each day. Both men and women participate. No one seems to mind or complain, so it's okay that they continue.
False.
False, right. Because in reality, it's very risky behavior, and you may not know that there's there's somebody who finds it offensive until you're sitting with the CEO because a complaint has come in. So you can't assume that it's okay. A male and female employee flirt with each other. He asks her out on a date. She turns him down and, realizing he was getting the wrong message, stops all flirting. It's okay if he continues to flirt and continues to ask her out, as he thinks it's just a matter of time until she says yes.
False.
Right, it's false. When should he have stopped? Well, and she didn't really say stop, did she? But
Stop flirting.
she stopped all of that flirtatious behavior, and he should have been able to pick up on that message, really, that she was no longer going down that road, right? So we have to be aware of other people's, not only verbal information that they may share, but nonverbal cues that they're giving us. When considering how to show respect for your coworkers, you simply have to treat them the way that you would like to be treated.
False.
Right. We have to actually put ourselves in their shoes and try to figure out how they would like to be treated. Okay? Supervisors are responsible for their own behavior and also for assuring a respectful work environment for their employees. True. It's okay to have questionable pictures in your workspace as long as they are not seen by your supervisor.
False.
False. That was a giveaway. All right. Well, the very last thing that I'm going to have to do is to look over that policy again, and I'm going to ask you to write your name and then sign it and date it. Yep, the policy that I handed out at the beginning. And if you would just leave those on the back table, that would be perfect.